dessert reception that we hope you all enjoy with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Director of MSU Jewish Studies, Professor Yael Aronoff, who will introduce our distinguished guest.
Well, it's an exciting evening for us to have Ambassador Dennis Ross. Before we get started, I'd just like to quickly thank our co-sponsors, so Jewish Studies and MSU Hillel Center, James Madison College, the Asian Studies Center, the College of Arts and Letters, and the College of Social Science all help support the opportunity that we have for Ambassador Ross to be with us this evening. I also just want to draw your attention before I introduce Ambassador Ross, even though I feel like he doesn't need an introduction, we all know him, that outside, as well as the books, for students, there's information on upcoming events, study abroad in Israel this summer, scholarships for study abroad in Israel this summer, stuff about minoring in Jewish studies, and for the community as well about upcoming events. And the next event we have is on November 18th on Greek Jewry and experience during the Holocaust and kind of building after the Holocaust, and our own Professor Ken Walzer is going to be part of that, so that's our next event that we're hosting. It's such a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Ross. I feel like I know him through all the readings that I've done of his multiple books, as well as an interview for my own book that I conducted it with him many years ago. But he's a Davidson Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Studies for several years now. And he's dedicated his life to government public service, working on U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East. So before 2011, he worked for a couple years as special envoy to President Obama, and also on the National Security Council directing the Central Region. And then he also was special envoy before that to Hillary Clinton. And before that, he worked, so he was a major player for 12 years in the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, before he was and did so again in the Obama administration. And so he's very well respected, I think, among both political parties and multiple administrations, and has worked with several secretaries of state. And what's fascinating, some of us had the opportunity to have dinner with him at Hillel, is he knows all the leaders of the past decades. He's met the Israeli leaders and Egyptian leaders and American leaders and so forth. So he's just a fascinating person to listen to and has a wealth of knowledge. And I have deep respect for him for all the serious efforts he has made to try to reach and resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, both the Palestinian-Israeli and the Syrian-Israeli especially. And I think in many, he's helped the parties come to certain agreements, like the Hebron Agreement and the Jordan-Israeli Peace Treaty in 1994. But even when a full peace agreement didn't succeed, I think he paved the way in making great progress towards making that happening. And he was just telling us about his back channel negotiations, even in the last couple of years, in trying to forge the conditions where one day we can reach a peace agreement. So we have deep respect for you and all your efforts, and wish you the best of success in the future. I'll just mention, of course, his most current book that just came out a couple weeks ago, I think, is Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli Relationship from Truman to Obama. Again, you can purchase it and get a signature after the talk for $20. I've just finished reading it, as has Ken Walzer, and we were very impressed by unbunking some of the assumptions. Past books include Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East, which I assigned to one of my honors options, and we had great discussions about it. The Missing Piece, the inside story of the fight for the Middle East peace, and Statecraft and How to Restore America's Standing in the World. I think Missing Piece was 800 pages or something, so I was assigned portions of it to my students. But we're really a privilege to not only have an academic who got a PhD from UCLA in the 70s and has written multiple academic articles and books, but someone who has a wealth of experience in influencing U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So we're very honored to have you.
Thank you. It's true. Can I do this?
Yes.
Maybe I can't do this. This one work? You know?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to break into song, unless there are requests. You know, it's interesting to be here on the 20th anniversary plus one day after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. You know, I'm often asked the question, would he have made a difference? Had he not been assassinated, would he have made a difference? And on the one hand, I'm always tempted to say, yes, he would have made a difference, just because, in a sense, he had a kind of credibility in Israel that almost nobody else had. On the other hand, he said to me 6 months before he was assassinated that the next election in Israel would be decided by Hamas. He said, 2 Hamas bombs and I won't be the Prime Minister of Israel. And it tells you that there's a lot of different factors that go into making peace. Some which you can control, some of which you can't control. What I want to do tonight is talk about the book. Obviously, that's why I'm on a book tour. But I want to set a little bit of a stage for you first, because there's been a wave of terror within Israel, and that wave of terror is producing what some people are asking me, at least, is this a third intifada? I'll just ask you to start with, because one of the things that I also teach, and so one of the things I do when I teach is I ask lots of questions. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions tonight, partly because it's my style of teaching, partly because it's a way to engage you in the discussion, partly because I just find it interesting. Right, so, do you think this is the third intifada?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, there's a real consensus here. The short answer is, I don't know if there's a new intifada or not, but I can tell you this looks dramatically different from the first two. I'm not actually sure it is an intifada. The first intifada was actually one that was carried out, it was called the Children of the Stones, and it was organized. It began at the end of 1987. It began as a result of a truck accident in Gaza, but it was then organized by the Tanzim, the Young Fatah activists. And the Young Fatah activists basically organized boycotts, strikes, they organized demonstrations, all very large. It was coherent. Those who took part in it were affiliated, meaning with different groups, and in a sense it was planned. The second intifada too. The second intifada begins the day after Ariel Sharon goes to the Temple Mount. And everybody thinks, all right, that's what precipitated it. What they don't know is that on the 3 days preceding that, including the day that he went to the intifada, I was going back and forth between the two small senior negotiators on each side. The Israeli negotiators and the Palestinian negotiators. We were meeting in the Washington, D.C. area. We were meeting at the request of the Palestinians. We had had several meetings. This is more than 2 months after the end of Camp David. We were going over what was the possible ways to bridge the differences between the two sides. And the idea was to see whether or not we might go ahead and offer a bridging proposal. So on September 26, 27, 28th, we're meeting, and I'm going back and forth between the two and then bringing them together. And on the 28th, when we met, you have to understand that there's a time difference between Washington and Israel. So when we met on the 28th at 9 in the morning, it was actually 4 in the afternoon in Israel, Sharon had been up to the Temple Mount and back. It was gone. The thing was over. And the Palestinian negotiators didn't raise the issue. Instead, as I went through where we were over these 3 days, and my impressions of what were the ways to bridge the differences on the core issues, I mean, the most significant issues, we're talking about Jerusalem, refugees, security and borders, I outlined to them what I could see were the possible points of convergence, and I felt there was enough convergence now to recommend to the President that we should go ahead with the bridging proposal. This is September 28th. Sharon has been in Temple Mountain and gone. 1 hour after I say goodbye to the groups, I get a call from George Tenet, who is at the time, he's the CIA director. And he says, what did you say to Mohammed? This is Mohammed Dakhlan, who's one of the negotiators, the head of security in Gaza. Because he said, there's going to be a deal. Meaning there's going to be a permanent status deal. And I said, look, I outlined what I saw as the possible points of convergence based on what I've heard, and that I thought that we could produce a proposal based on these elements. Each side got a sense of what it would look like and what I was describing, and that's what I said to him. And he said, well, he says there's going to be a deal. An hour later, I get a call from Danny Utone, who is the chief of staff of Ehud Barak's, the Prime Minister of Israel. And he says, look, there's going to be violent demonstrations throughout the West Bank and Gaza tomorrow. We know that our Arafat is organizing them. And we know what, in fact, you have proposed, what you're likely to propose, and the Prime Minister is willing to go along with it. He can accept it, but he can't accept it if there's going to be an outbreak of violence. And we would ask you not to make a proposal because we can't be making concessions in the face of violence. And so, obviously, he was asking us to go to Arafat to try to stop this. And we do go to Arafat, and he doesn't stop it. In fact, he produces it. The Second Intifada is also planned and organized. It probably takes on a life of its own that goes beyond what, in fact, Arafat had intended. That's probably true. But nonetheless, this was something that was structured, planned. Fatah takes part in it. The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades are a part of it. Then Hamas comes in, Islamic Jihad comes in. Again, the groups are organized, they're affiliated, and there's a lot of violence. Now, what we're seeing now isn't organized. It's being carried out by 15 to 25-year-olds. They have no affiliation with any group. It's been largely incited by a false narrative that Israel is changing the status quo on the Temple Mount, on the Haram al-Sharif. That they're going to do to the Al-Aqsa Mosque what exists in Hebron, which is where you have the Tomb of the Patriarchs and the Abraham Mosque, meaning you're going to share this facility. Completely untrue. Those who are carrying out the attacks are frequently, when they do it, they're saying, you know, they're doing it for Al-Aqsa. They're protecting it. So what you have is a level of incitement on social media. What you have is a false narrative. What you have is no organization. And you have 15 to 25-year-olds, and it's largely random. So it doesn't look like either the first or the second Intifada. I can't say if it's going to peter out. I mean, the fact that it's not organized could be a good sign. The fact that it's not organized could be a bad sign. You know, it's too soon to know. It may calm down, and if it does, that's good, obviously. But if the situation remains as it is, you know, you're going to have an eruption again. So, why do I raise this apart from wanting to create a context for the discussion? I raise it because I want to say something about the Obama administration's response to it. When this began, the initial response was not to call these acts of terror. It was to call them acts of violence, and it was to caution against the cycle of violence. Now, let's describe what these acts are. Excuse me. These are probably the most intimate form of terror that you can have. There's no abstraction here. Those who stab know who their victims, see who their victims are. And it's literally a form of bloodletting. There are sites that Hamas has on its website that basically explain how to stab a Jew to have maximum effect. That's what it says. It doesn't say stab an Israeli, how to stab a Jew. But it's intimate. It is a form of terror, for sure. Not a form, it is terror, for sure. And the initial reaction was to call this violence and to caution against a cycle of violence. Well, this is terror, pure and simple, but there was a hesitancy to call it that. In addition to that, there was even a hesitancy, at least initially, to focus only on the Palestinians, not only talk about a cycle of violence, but even the whole issue of settlements was brought in at a certain point. The administration sort of backs off of that after a week or so, but the initial impulse was not to be in a position where we would be, in a sense, condemning only Palestinians or calling this terror. And the reason reflects a mindset. And the mindset is a mindset that has existed in every administration from Truman to Obama. It is a mindset, as part of a national security constituency, in which basically, if you are seen as being too close to Israel, that's bad. If you are seen as being prepared to criticize only the Palestinians, that will produce a backlash, and that's bad. If you are seen as somehow doing something that could make the sense Arabs angry, that's going to cost us. This mindset, as I said, has existed in every administration from Truman to Obama. Okay? Now that's my kind of intro. I said before I was going to ask questions. I'm going to ask questions, right? All right, so here's a question for you. I just said in every administration from Truman to Obama, there has been a mindset that basically looks at Israel as a problem, not as a partner. There has been a national security constituency throughout every administration that has seen Israel as basically being a liability to us and that we need to find ways to separate from it. Now there's only one administration in which that constituency exists but has no influence. All right, I'm going to repeat it. In every administration, you have this constituency that sees Israel as a problem and not as a partner. And it's part of a constituency, a group, that basically is there from 48 until today. In one administration, that group had no influence. Which administration was that? Good question. Which administration did this group that exists in every one have no influence?
Reagan.
Reagan? No.
Nixon. Carter.
Carter? Carter? The question was, this is a group that sees Israel as a problem. And I'm saying, which administration did that group that sees Israel as a problem have no influence? In Carter, the only group that existed was one that saw Israel as a problem.
Bush.
Bush?
Yeah.
Bush 43?
The last Bush.
The last Bush, Bush 43.
Yeah.
Good guess. Actually, excellent guess. Wrong. But an excellent guess. And I'm going to explain why it's an excellent guess. And it's the one I expected that people would guess. In fact, the reason it's such an excellent guess is in July of 2009, President Obama meets with a group of Jewish leaders, and one of them says to him, look, if you want the Israelis to take risks for peace, they need to have you right next to them. They need to know you're there so that they take risks that you're going to handle it, so that the closer you are to them, the better. And President Obama responds by saying, for 8 years, there was no daylight between the Bush administration and the Israelis, and what did it get us? The Israelis stood pat, did nothing, and it cost us with the Arabs. All right? So, President Obama, who was here, he would guess the same thing that you did. I'm going to explain in a second why it's wrong. I'm going to explain who it is, but I want to explain, in a sense, the fact that President Obama thought that there was no daylight, first, and that it achieved nothing. I mean, first, it's actually wrong. Ariel Sharon, because he felt that Bush was close to him, was prepared to unilaterally get out of Gaza and for settlements in the West Bank. Not to mention that Ehud Olmert makes a proposal that goes beyond the Clinton parameters. Again, because he feels that Bush is very close to him. So, factually, it's actually wrong. But it also turns out to be wrong because there was a period where this constituency that I'm describing that sees Israel as a problem has a significant amount of weight. And the proof of that is George W. Bush, President Bush, his first call to Ariel Sharon after 9/11, after he has declared a war on terror, he is pressing Ariel Sharon to have his foreign minister, Shimon Peres, see Yasser Arafat. And at the same time, there are bombs going off in Israel. George W. Bush would not have dreamed of having us talk to those who were responsible for 9/11. But he's pressing Ariel Sharon to have his foreign minister meet Yasser Arafat at a time when there are bombs going off in Israel. And Arafat is clearly, if not completely responsible for it, he's doing absolutely nothing to prevent it. So why does this happen? Because this constituency that I was describing feels that 9/11 happens because we're too close to Israel, because there's no peace with the Palestinians. And that if it hadn't been for the absence of peace with the Palestinians, in fact, this never would have happened, and we won't get others to join with us in a war on terror unless we solve the Palestinian problem. That's why they do it. That's why, he's asked to make this call, and he does it. What is interesting is that Sharon initially resists and then agrees. And not only does he agree to have Peres see Arafat, but he himself, for the first time, makes a speech where he accepts a two-state outcome. Now, some of you may recall that on October 4th, 2001, Sharon gives a speech where he says, "We will not be Czechoslovakia." And the US, the leader of the West, the leader of the free world, can't sacrifice our interests in the pursuit of the Arabs. Now, he does it because he's had Peres see Arafat, he himself has made this speech, and the terror doesn't stop. Now, it is true that George W. Bush doesn't really appreciate being equated with Neville Chamberlain. But what does happen as a result of that speech is that Bush decides to create a direct channel from the White House to the Prime Minister's office. Okay, so I haven't answered the question, which administration did this group that saw Israel as a problem, not as a partner, which administration did it have no influence in?
Nixon?
No, you'll see shortly, very much untrue for Nixon.
It could only be Clinton.
Yes, it's Bill Clinton. Now, it is true I'm Bill Clinton's negotiator, so maybe that has something to do with it. But there's a deeper reason. Bill Clinton believes that the U.S. is Israel's only friend in the world. And we can have differences with Israel, but the idea that you will create daylight, the idea that you'll create a wedge between the United States and Israel, he believes that gives encouragement to Israel's enemies and that it will weaken Israel's deterrent. So it is Bill Clinton. Okay, so this is kind of fun, right?
How about Robert Malley?
How about,
Malley?
what about him?
Wasn't he leaning towards the Palestinian position?
I said, I said, did the group have influence? I said, which administration did they have no influence? I said, they exist. In every administration, they exist. They existed in Clinton's, but they had no weight. All right, so, I'm on a roll, so I'm going to ask another question. All right, so which administration is the worst for Israel? Which is the administration is the hardest on Israel? Obama? Bush 1? Carter? Obviously, the answer isn't right yet.
Reagan.
Reagan, and Reagan's interesting, but not Reagan. What was that last one? Eisenhower. Yes. Have you read the book already? Since you got Clinton too, so you're all right. You're 2 for 2. So I can call on you anyway. But all right. So yeah, it's Eisenhower. Eisenhower comes in, and Eisenhower believes that Truman made his decisions only for political reasons. He believes that Truman, basically for the Jewish vote, that was it. And why does he believe it? Because Truman recognizes Israel over the opposition of all of his national security establishment. All of the so-called wise men. Right? So it's George C. Marshall, Secretary of State, Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, George Kennan, who is the author of Containment. All of the so-called wise men are against the recognition of the state. And Truman recognizes it anyway. So Eisenhower views it, well, he couldn't have done it based on the merits. He couldn't have done it for national security reasons. He had to do it for political reasons. And he comes in and he's determined to change that. Now there's an interesting reality here. First I should say something about what the reality of the Truman administration was, and then I'll get into the Eisenhower administration. Now it is true that Truman does recognize over the opposition of all of his national security advisors. In fact, I'll tell the story of what happens on May 12, 1948. on May 12, 1948, Truman has a meeting with the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, the Undersecretary of State, Robert Lovett, and he asked Clark Clifford to join him. Clark Clifford is domestic counselor. Now, the reason for the timing of the meeting is at midnight, 12:01 on May 15th, the British will complete their withdrawal from Palestine. And we know at that point that there's a high probability that the Jews will go ahead, that the Shi will go ahead and declare itself a state. So he calls the meeting because he wants to discuss, should we recognize at that point or not? So Marshall comes in, he sees Clifford there, and he says, what is he doing here? This is a national security issue. He's a political person. And Truman says, well, I asked him to be here. Okay. So Marshall goes ahead and outlines why we shouldn't recognize. And Lovett, who is the undersecretary, reinforces. He says, shouldn't recognize in addition to what Marshall has said about not recognizing, what happens with Lovett. Lovett actually says we shouldn't recognize because they'll be filled with communist agents. There'll be a Soviet outlet. Very remarkable thing to say, but he says it. Truman turns to Clifford and he says, what would be the arguments for doing this? And Marshall's not happy. I mean, he begins to get agitated at this point, but he doesn't say anything yet. Now, it happens that Clifford has written 2 memos. One memo is in March, one memo is in May, and he's outlined all the reasons that you ought to recognize. And by the way, every single one of his arguments is a national security argument. He makes no political arguments. In this meeting, he starts by saying we should recognize because, notwithstanding the predictions of all the experts in the administration, it looks like, in fact, the Jews are a growing concern in their state. Now, the reason he starts that way is because the day before the partition plan is going to be voted on at the UN, the CIA issues an intelligence finding, an assessment. And the timing is, I'm sure, just a coincidence. Now, in their CIA assessment, the day before the partition vote at the UN, they say there is no way a Jewish state can be viable. It cannot last more than 2 years. It can only last more than that as if you put a very large number of soldiers, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers there to basically fight for them. Okay? Now, we don't fight for them. We impose an arms embargo on December 5th, after the partition plan. Who does the arms embargo penalize? Because the British are providing arms to the Egyptians. They're providing arms to the Arab Legion, which, by the way, is financed and officered by seconded British officers. And it's the Trans-Jordanian Army, but it's the Arab Legion. They're in the West Bank. And, of course, to Iraq. All these weapons, of course, seep into Palestine. We impose an arms embargo, meaning we're penalizing only one side, no arms to the Jews. Okay? So we've done nothing to help. George Kennan and Roy Henderson write a memo in January where they are saying the same thing. No way can this be a viable state. It takes a large presence of us there to be able to sustain it. Clifford says they were all wrong. We haven't helped them, and yet they're the ones who are winning on the ground. So if you don't recognize them, then you're penalizing them even though you supported the partition plan. How can we do that? That damages our credibility. That's his first argument. His second argument is that if we give in to the threats of Arabs about violence, if we recognize, that's a form of appeasement. Why would we engage in a form of appeasement? That will too undercut our credibility. And the third argument he makes is that those who say the Arabs will cut us off from the oil, that's absurd because they can't drink their oil. We're their market, they have to sell it. Now at this point, Marshall has become really agitated. And Marshall intervenes and he says, these are all political arguments. Now he hasn't made one political argument. He says, these are all political arguments, and if I were to vote, now this is George C. Marshall, he's a lifelong soldier. He said, if I were to vote in the election and you do this, I wouldn't vote for you. Pretty amazing, right? The president at this point, Truman, decides to end the meeting and says, well, General, I'm inclined to agree with you. Now Lovett, even though Lovett has said what he said about how the new state will be basically, you know, an island of Soviet, a den of Soviet spies, and the Soviets will use it, which is completely absurd. But because actually Clifford sort of says to him, these are people trying to escape that. So that night, Lovett is uneasy about what has happened in the meeting. So he calls up Clifford, he goes to see him, and he says, look, let's work this out. We can't have this kind of a divide between the president and the secretary. And so they agree, after Israel declares itself, we will recognize. And we recognize 11 minutes after the declaration. What is interesting, though, about the Truman administration is that not only did that arms embargo get imposed after partition, it is sustained for the whole life of the Truman administration. Israel is invaded the day after, you know, the day it declares itself a state, May 15th. It's invaded by every one of its neighbors. And we keep the arms embargo. It takes until January 31, after Israel's first vote on January 31, 1949, for us even to provide any assistance to Israel. We don't provide a lot. We provide some loans, some grant assistance. But understand at the time, Israel is absorbing the Jews of the Arab world who have been forced to leave with no goods, with no assets. It's actually a wealthy population that is denied the ability to leave with any of its assets or its resources. And they're having to absorb them. People forget that in the first couple of years of Israel's existence, they typically had never more than 1 week's worth of food reserves in the country. But we don't provide assistance under Truman until after the first vote. And then the assistance, as I said, it's not significant. Now I mention all this because Eisenhower has this perception of Truman. He was completely, in Eisenhower's eyes, biased towards the Jews, and he was going to have a different policy. He was going to shape a different policy in the Middle East. It was going to be a Middle East that took account of what our real interests were. Our real interests were with the Arabs. Our real interests were with oil. And as a result, we were going to reflect our real interests. He doesn't. I mean, when he comes in, the Israelis actually begin to use Jordan River water as a form of irrigation. There's a protest from the Arabs, and Eisenhower suspends the loans to the Israelis because they shouldn't be doing that. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, takes a 3-week trip to the Middle East, reflecting again what is our basic interest. His first stop is in Lebanon. He sees the president of Lebanon in the first stop, and he says, we will have a very different policy in the Middle East. And that very different policy that we're going to have in the Middle East, one of the things that we're going to do, we are going to counter Israeli aggression. I'm quoting, this is a quote from a Memcon. We are going to counter Israeli aggression. Now, again, I would just remind you, this is May of 1953. Does Israel have any occupied territory at this point? Well, this isn't after the 6-7 War, this is May of 1953. This is a very small state. But we're going to counter Israeli aggression, by the way, with the exception of Lebanon. Lebanon is the only place where Fedayeen attacks into Israel are not being conducted. But out of Egypt, out of Syria, and from the West